So this video will talk a little bit about some of the classical models of democracy, and with regards to the questions that are on the exam. These remaining questions that are on the exam are drawn from the specific chapters in the textbook to allow you to start to think more deeply about a specific model or philosopher and their ideas. Now, Held uses this graphic to illustrate the different variants of democracy and the challenges in thinking about democracy, because it's really not a simple linear chart, because the linkages and influences among the variations go in different directions, right? So you can see all the different arrows going. However, he says that all but one of the models can be divided into two broad types. Direct or participatory democracy and liberal or representative democracy. So we have the classical type democracy, which is the Athenian democracy. We have republicanism, direct democracy. Classical democracy is a form of direct democracy. And then you have republicanism and liberal democracy, both of which are forms of representative democracy. In very general terms, we can say that classical or Athenian democracy provides the foundation for future thinking about democracy and led to these broad types. So there's at least one question on each of these models. We have classical democracy or Athenian democracy. We have republicanism with two strands, developmental and protective. And we have liberal democracy, again, with two strands, protective and developmental. And then we have direct democracy. Under the contemporary forms of democracy, we have competitive elitist democracy, including technocracy, pluralism and neopluralism, which includes corporatism. We have legal democracy and participatory democracy, deliberative democracy, and then the final two that Held proposes, democratic autonomy and cosmopolitan democracy. So there's four models that are considered classic. Questions 5, 6, and 7 are the first three questions in this section. Question 5 is about Athenian democracy. It says Athenian democracy was quite different from what we call democracy today. Why is it paradoxical to call Athens democratic? What was it about Athenian democracy that has inspired democrats through the ages? And chapter 6 is a question about republicanism. During the period of the Renaissance, two strands of republicanism developed, developmental and protective. Discuss the similarities and differences of the two types of republicanism, referring to at least two of the following political philosophers, Marsilius of Padua, Niccolo Machiavelli, or Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And then the seventh question is about Mary Wollstonecraft. The question says, some theorists believe that Mary Wollstonecraft's ideas constituted a central contribution to the analysis of the conditions for a possibility of democracy. Why are her ideas considered important to the evolution of democratic ideas? What other philosophers or theorists address the role of women in the democratic process? So with classical democracy, which is question 5, ancient Athens is that classic example of direct democracy. With about 40,000 citizens, it was technically possible for all 40,000 people to meet together in an assembly hall, but it was rare to have more than half show up. And this assembly met 40 times per year to settle issues. Other offices were filled by random selection or sortition. And there was about 1,000 of these other offices, and these were rotated around. So it was a very different type of way of thinking about how to run a country, right? So it's that's part of the appeal of Athenian democracy. But we know that it would be very difficult to make it work well in larger societies. And Held makes that very clear about the huge debates about the practicality of this sort of Athenian style of democracy. But in this vision of democracy, politics was intended to be a natural social activity, not just something that was separated from the rest of life like it is today. Now, question 6 focuses on those two strands of republicanism, and you may remember that compared to ancient Athens, the republicanism of the 11th century in the Italian city-states may not have seemed very innovative, but compared to the rest of feudal Europe, it was quite remarkable because these republics really represented a challenge to the prevailing Christian worldview, in which in the Christian worldview, government was God-given. It was a God-given form of lordship. So in spite of the positive qualities like that, this idea that it's quite innovative, there were problems. It still was a very exclusive membership to be part of citizens, right? The citizens were really just men who were rich, nominees of the nobility initially, and so on. So it wasn't perfect by any means. And I mentioned the two strands. We have developmental republicanism. So this is the idea that democracy and political participation was supposed to help citizens to develop as human beings. So the model builds on elements of this classical Greek thinking about democracy, where political participation is a necessary part of a good life. And then protective republicanism is based on the idea that democracy and government is primarily for the protection of citizens' individual aims and objectives, such as their personal liberty. And this model can be traced to the Roman historians and emphasizes the fragile nature of civic virtue and vulnerability to corruption when collective decision-making is undermined, which then threatens personal liberty. So the idea of this protective republicanism is it's to protect the rights of individuals as opposed to developing citizens as human beings. Now, the resurgence of concerns about self-government during the Renaissance had a significant influence on 17th century Britain, America, and France. We see shifts in the meanings depending on the country that these things developed in. We see shifts in the idea of how the idea of citizen involved, what the idea of civic virtue means, and we can ask the question, is civic virtue something that's missing in democracy today? Are private interests and public interests opposed to each other? What does it mean to be truly represented? And I had a short TED Talk video on sortition if you're interested in reviewing that. We have some more forms of republicanism that you can address in question 6. So question 6 allows you to focus on the different theorists of republicanism, such as Marsilius of Padua, Niccolo Machiavelli, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And then question 7 allows you to choose to focus on Mary Wollstonecraft's ideas and the role of women in the story of democracy. I'm going to pause here then the next video will be on question number 8, which is about liberal democracy.